The cantina on Nexus Station buzzed with the usual mix of traders, pilots, and soldiers from a dozen different worlds. Purple smoke drifted through the air from Zolonian pipes, while the sweet smell of Altarian honey wine mixed with the metallic scent of recycled air. At a corner table, hidden in shadows, sat Commander Zexthara. The Velthari officer looked nothing like the proud warrior he had been 5 years ago. His purple skin had faded to a sickly gray, and his forearms shook whenever he lifted his drink. His compound eyes, once sharp and alert, now darted nervously around the room like a hunted animal. The other patrons gave him a wide berth. Everyone on the station knew his story, or at least parts of it. Lieutenant Kreval approached the table slowly. The young Velthari had heard whispers about his former commander, stories that seemed too wild to believe. He had served under Zexthara, briefly before the Human War, when the commander was still confident and strong. Now he barely recognized the broken figure before him. "Commander Zexthara," Kreval said softly, sliding into the seat across from him. "May I join you?" Zexthara looked up with bloodshot eyes. His mandibles clicked nervously as he recognized the younger officer. "Lieutenant Kreval, you should not be seen with me. It will hurt your career." "I don't care about my career right now," Kreval replied. "I need to know what really happened out there. The official reports say we achieved a strategic victory. They say the humans agreed to the ceasefire because they recognized our superior military strength." A harsh laugh escaped from Zexthara's throat. It was not a pleasant sound. Strategic victory? Is that what they're calling it? He took a long drink from his glass, his hands shaking so badly that liquid spilled down his chin. "Sit down, young one. But know that what I tell you will change everything you believe about war." Kreval leaned forward, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Around them, the cantina continued its normal routine, but their corner felt isolated from the rest of the galaxy. "You want to know about the humans," Zexthara continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone does. They want to understand how a species that had barely left their home system could force the mighty Velthari Empire to the negotiating table. They think it was luck, or superior technology, or some secret weapon we haven't discovered yet." He paused to take another drink, his eyes staring into the amber liquid as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "I commanded the 7th Battle Fleet when we first encountered them at Kepler 442b. It was supposed to be a simple operation. Intelligence said the humans had established a small mining colony there. Maybe 1,000 workers, a few security guards. Nothing our forces couldn't handle in an afternoon." Zexthara's voice grew distant as he remembered. "We sent the standard surrender demand. Every civilized species knows the protocol. We demonstrate our superior firepower, make reasonable demands, and accept their submission. It had worked on 17 other worlds, but the humans refused," Kreval prompted. "Oh, they did more than refuse." Zexthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. "Their commander, a female named Captain Jake Morrison, sent back a message. She thanked us for the warning and said they were looking forward to the fight. Looking forward to it. As if we had invited them to a celebration instead of threatening them with destruction." The old commander's forearms gestured weakly as he continued. "We began our standard bombardment. Precision strikes on military targets, communication arrays, power generation facilities. Standard siege warfare designed to force quick surrender with minimal casualties. But the humans ... they adapted." Kreval noticed that other patrons had begun to listen, though they pretended to focus on their own conversations. Stories about the human war were rare, and most were heavily censored by military command. Captain Morrison had an assistant, Lieutenant Amy Brooks. Young, barely out of their military academy, according to our intelligence. But when Morrison was injured in the first bombardment, Brooks took command. And that's when we learned our first lesson about human warfare. Zextharas. Eyes focused on something far away, seeing battles that existed now only in memory and nightmare. Every species we had ever fought followed predictable patterns. Lose your command structure, lose your will to fight. Cut off supplies, force surrender. Demonstrate overwhelming superiority. Achieve quick victory. But humans don't follow patterns. He leaned closer to Krival, his voice dropping even lower. Brooks didn't just take command. She transformed that mining colony into something else entirely. They started using the mining equipment as weapons. Industrial lasers became anti-ship. Guns, excavation charges became orbital mines. Transport vehicles became mobile fortresses. That's impressive adaptation, Krival said, but surely your fleet could handle modified mining equipment. You're missing the point, Zexthara replied sharply. It wasn't about the equipment. It was about them. Brooks organized the civilian. Miners into combat units. Parents fighting alongside their children. Engineers and accountants learning to use military weapons in hours instead of years. But the truly terrifying part was how they talked about it. The commander paused to drain his glass, signaling for another. The server, a nervous Altarian, quickly brought a replacement and hurried away. They were excited, Zexthara continued. Our communication specialists intercepted their radio chatter. They were actually enjoying the challenge. One of their mining supervisors, a man named Pete Wilson, joked about finally having something interesting to do. A medical technician named Carol Davis started treating the whole thing like a game, keeping score of successful defensive actions. Krival felt a chill run through his exoskeleton. They treated warfare like entertainment? Worse than that, they treated impossible odds like motivation. Zexthara's voice carried a note of genuine fear. When we destroyed their main communication tower, they cheered. When we cut off their supply lines, they started rationing like it was a fun challenge. When we demonstrated our superior firepower by obliterating a nearby asteroid, they began making jokes about showing off. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very air was listening to the commander's words. But the moment I truly understood what we were facing came 3 days into the siege. Lieutenant Brooks sent us another message. She was standing in the ruins of their command center, injured and exhausted, surrounded by determined civilians who had never seen combat before that week. Zexthara's hands trembled as he lifted his fresh drink. She looked directly into the camera and smiled. Not the desperate smile of someone trying to maintain morale. Not the false bravado of a doomed soldier. She smiled like someone who had just discovered something wonderful. What did she say? Krival asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. She said, "Thank you for giving us a reason to show you what humans can really do when we try." Zexthara's voice broke slightly. And then she laughed. She actually laughed at us. The old commander stared into his drink for a long moment before, looking up at his former subordinate. That was when I realized we weren't fighting a species that wanted to win a war. We were fighting a species that had been waiting their entire evolution for a war worth fighting. Zexthara ordered another drink while Lieutenant Krival sat in stunned silence. The cantina around them continued its normal evening routine, but their corner table felt like an island of terrible knowledge in a sea of ignorance. The old commander's hands had stopped shaking, but his eyes still held the haunted look of someone who had seen things that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. The mining colony was just the beginning, Zexthara continued, his voice taking on. The flat tone of someone reciting facts too painful to feel. After Kepler 442b, High Command decided we needed a decisive victory, something that would break human morale and force their government to surrender. They chose Firebase Charlie. Krival leaned forward. He had heard whispers about Firebase. Charlie and the officer mess halls, but no one ever spoke about it directly. It was one of those battles that existed in official reports, but never in casual conversation. Firebase Charlie was a human-forward operating base on the edge of the Tau Ceti system, Zexthara explained. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. Maybe 50 soldiers, basic defensive positions, standard military equipment. High Command thought it would be perfect for demonstrating Velthari superiority. Send 10,000 warriors. Achieve overwhelming victory. Broadcast the results across human space. The commander paused to take a sip of his drink. Around them, a group of Altarian traders argued loudly about shipping routes, their voices providing cover for the darker conversation. Major Ben Carter commanded the base. According to our files, he was a career officer with no special qualifications. His second in command was Sergeant Lisa Murphy, barely 25 years old by human standards. The rest were standard infantry, engineers, and support staff. Nothing that should have concerned a proper military force. Zexthara's voice grew quieter as he continued. We surrounded the base and cut off all supply lines. No food shipments. No ammunition deliveries. No medical supplies. We jammed their communications so they couldn't call for help. Standard siege warfare. Any rational species would have surrendered within days. But the humans didn't surrender, Krival said. It wasn't really a question. They didn't even try to negotiate. Zexthara's mandibles clicked in what might have been admiration or terror. Instead, they started adapting. When we cut off their food supplies, they began growing vegetables in their combat helmets. Sergeant Chris Taylor, their demolitions expert, figured out how to make the base's recycling system more efficient. They were drinking purified wastewater and acting like it was a clever engineering solution. The old commander gestured weakly, with one of his 4 arms. We monitored their radio communications. They were making jokes about the situation. Corporal Nina Rodriguez started a betting pool on how long their rations would last. Private Dan Foster was teaching other soldiers how to catch and cook the local insects. They treated starvation like a puzzle to solve instead of a reason to surrender. Krival tried to imagine his own people in the same situation. Velthari warriors were brave, but they were also practical. Facing impossible odds with no hope of resupply, any reasonable commander would seek terms. But humans don't think like we do, Zexthara continued, as if reading his thoughts. When we destroyed their main barracks, they moved into the underground. Maintenance tunnels. When we knocked out their power generator, they rigged hand-cranked systems. Every setback became a new challenge for them to overcome. The commander's voice took on a note of genuine bewilderment. Sergeant Murphy organized what she called improvement teams, small groups that would sneak out at night to steal our equipment or sabotage our positions. They were outnumbered 200 to 1, had no heavy weapons, and were slowly starving. But they kept attacking us. That doesn't make tactical sense, Krival said. Nothing they did made sense, Zexthara replied. Private Foster held a choke point. In the tunnel system for 18 straight hours. 18 hours without food, water, rest, or relief. When we finally broke through, we found him unconscious, but still gripping his weapon. The medics said he should have collapsed hours earlier, but somehow he kept fighting. The old commander stared into his drink as if it contained memories he couldn't escape. Corporal Rodriguez continued sabotage missions even after suffering severe burns from an explosion. She couldn't use her hands properly, but she learned to operate explosives with her feet. The human capacity for adaptation seemed unlimited. How long did the siege last? Krival asked, though he wasn't sure. He wanted to know. 3 months, Zexthara said quietly. 3 standard months. 50 humans held off 10,000 Velthari warriors for 3 months. But that wasn't the worst part. The lieutenant waited for him to continue. The worst part was their attitude. Even as they got weaker, even as their situation became more desperate, they never stopped being cheerful. They sang songs while they worked. They told jokes during combat. They celebrated small victories, like successfully repairing a broken communication device or finding edible plants. Zextharas' voice cracked slightly. I personally observed Major Carter during the final assault. He had been wounded 3 times, hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks, and knew his position was hopeless. But when he saw our forces approaching, he smiled. Actually smiled and said something to his troops that made them laugh. What did he say? Krevel whispered. He said, "Well, looks like we get to find out how tough we really are." The commander's hands began shaking again. And then they started singing, all of them together, some kind of human battle song. They sang while they fought, sang while they died, sang even as their base fell around them. The cantina seemed to fade away as Zixthara continued his story. But the moment that truly broke my understanding of warfare came near the end. Sergeant Murphy was alone in the communications bunker, trying to get a message out to Human Command. She had been shot twice and was losing blood. The bunker was on fire, and our forces were breaking down the door. She could have surrendered, Krevel said. She could have. Should have. Any sane being would have. Instead, she looked straight at our assault team and started laughing. Not hysterical laughter, not the laugh of someone who had lost their mind. She was genuinely amused by something. Zexthara finished his drink in one gulp. One of my officers asked her what was so funny. She pointed to her radio equipment and said, "I just realized that if you guys are this much trouble for 50 humans, you're going to have a really bad time when you meet the other 8 billion. The old commander looked directly at Krevel. That's when I understood. We weren't fighting 50 desperate soldiers defending a remote outpost. We were fighting 50 representatives of a species that treats impossible situations as entertainment. And there were billions more just like them. What happened to Firebase Charlie? Krevel asked. We took it eventually. But it cost us 3,000 casualties and most of our heavy equipment. The humans fought until the very end, and even then, they never stopped believing they could win. Zexthara signaled for another drink. That's when I started having the nightmares. The cantina had grown quieter as the evening wore on. Most of the traders and casual drinkers had left, leaving only the serious drinkers and those with nowhere else to go. Zexthara had consumed several more glasses of whatever liquid courage, helped him tell his story, while Lieutenant Krevel sat transfixed by the increasingly disturbing tale. Firebase Charlie should have been the end of it, Zexthara continued, his voice slurring slightly. High Command thought the humans would see reason after losing 50 of their best soldiers. They sent diplomatic messages offering generous surrender terms. The humans could keep their core worlds, maintain their government, even keep a small defensive fleet. All they had to do was acknowledge Velthari's superiority and accept our guidance. They refused again, Krevel said. It wasn't a question. Anymore, they didn't just refuse. They laughed at us. Zexthara's compound eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the cantina walls. Their response came from someone called Colonel Rick Hayes. He thanked us for the offer and said they were looking forward to showing us what real human warfare looked like. Then he did something that still gives me nightmares. The old commander paused to steady his shaking hands. He sent us a data package, historical records from human military conflicts, hundreds of years of warfare, from their ancient battles with swords and spears to their modern conflicts with advanced weapons. At first, we thought it was a gift, intelligence data to help us understand our enemy better. But it wasn't a gift. Krevel said quietly, it was a warning. Zexthara's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Hayes included a personal message. He said that everything we had seen so far was humans fighting defensively, on their terms, in prepared positions. He wanted us to see what happened when humans went on the attack. The commander signaled for another drink, but his hands were shaking too badly to lift it properly. The first attacks came within days. Small human ships, maybe a dozen crew members each, started hitting our supply convoys. We lost 3 major shipments in the first week. The attacks were coordinated, precise, and completely unexpected. How could such small forces cause significant damage? Kreval asked, because they weren't fighting like we expected. Zextharas' mandibles clicked rapidly. Every species we had ever encountered followed established military doctrine. Engage. With superior forces, control strategic locations, maintain supply lines. But the humans under Colonel Hayes didn't try to control anything. They just destroyed. The old commander's voice took on the tone of someone reciting a list of disasters. Captain Maria Santos led a team that infiltrated our main supply depot. Instead of trying to capture it, they simply destroyed everything. Weapons, food, medical supplies, spare parts. Billions of credits worth of equipment turned into scrap metal in one night. One infiltration team did all that damage? Kreval found it hard to believe. Santos had maybe 20 people with her. They used our own security systems against us, turned our automated defenses into weapons aimed at our own supplies. But the terrifying part wasn't the damage they caused. It was how they did it. Zextharas' voice cracked. Our security recordings showed them working. They were completely calm, efficient, professional, like they were performing routine maintenance. Instead of sabotage. The commander managed to take a sip of his drink. Major Steve Thompson specialized in what humans call psychological warfare. He would broadcast messages to our troops, not threatening them, but educating them. He explained exactly how humans had defeated other enemies throughout their history. He described their tactics, their weapons, their willingness to sacrifice anything for victory. Surely your soldiers weren't affected by enemy propaganda, Kreval said. Thompson wasn't trying to convince us to surrender. He was trying to make us afraid, and it worked. Zextharas' eyes were wide with remembered terror. He told us about something called the Siege of Leningrad, humans defending a city for nearly 3 years, eating leather and wallpaper paste to survive, but never giving up. He described the Battle of Stalingrad, where humans fought for individual buildings, individual rooms, for months. The old commander leaned forward, his voice becoming more urgent. But the worst story was about something called the Baton Death March. Thousands of human soldiers, starving and beaten, forced to walk hundreds of miles by their enemies. Thompson explained how many of them survived through pure stubbornness, how they helped each other even when helping meant their own death. Why would he tell you stories about human defeats? Kreval asked, confused. Because they weren't defeats, Zextharas said simply. Every story ended with humans eventually winning. Thompson was showing us that humans could survive anything, endure anything, and still find a way to victory. He was proving that no matter how badly we hurt them, they would never stop fighting. The commander's 4 arms gestured weakly. Lieutenant Commander Alex Parker developed tactics that we still don't understand. He would use small ships to attack our major fleet formations, not trying to destroy them, but to force them into specific positions. Then other human units would attack from completely different directions, catching us while we were responding to the first threat. That sounds like standard fleet tactics, Kreval said. It should have been, but Parker's coordination was perfect. Ships separated by light years, with no apparent communication, would execute complex maneuvers with split-second timing. Our analysts still can't figure out how they coordinated such precise attacks across such vast distances. Zextharas' voice grew distant. Captain Jennifer Wright perfected what she called logistical warfare. Instead of attacking our ships or bases, she targeted our supply chains. Transport vessels, fuel depots, manufacturing facilities. She never fought battles, but she made it impossible for us to fight battles. How effective could attacks on supplies really be? Krival wondered. Wright destroyed our ability to maintain the war effort. Our ships couldn't get fuel, our bases couldn't get food, our wounded couldn't get medical supplies. She turned our entire military into a logistics problem we couldn't solve. The commander's hands shook as he continued. But the worst part was how she did it. Wright would send warnings to civilian workers, telling them exactly when and where she would attack. She gave them time to evacuate, time to save their lives. That seems almost merciful, Krival said. That's what made it so terrifying. She was destroying our war machine while going out of her way to avoid killing non-combatants. It proved that human warfare wasn't driven by hatred or bloodlust. It was driven by calculation, by purpose, by absolute dedication to achieving specific goals. Zexthara finished his drink and stared at the empty glass. Admiral Linda Jackson and General Mike Collins began coordinating larger operations. They would sacrifice entire battle groups as distractions while their real objectives were happening somewhere else. They used their own losses as weapons against us. How can losses be weapons? Krival asked. Because humans calculate acceptable casualties differently than we do. Collins would lose 1,000 soldiers to save 10,000 civilians. Jackson would sacrifice a dozen ships to protect a supply convoy. They weren't careless with their people's lives, but they weren't paralyzed by the fear of losing them either. The old commander looked directly at his former subordinate. That's when I realized we weren't fighting a war. We were fighting a species that had turned war itself into a science. The cantina was nearly empty now. Only a few patrons remained, huddled over their drinks in the dim lighting. Zexthara had been talking for hours, and his voice was hoarse from the strain of reliving memories he had tried to forget. Lieutenant. Krival sat across from him, no longer the eager young officer who had approached the table. The stories had changed him, just as the war had changed his former commander. High Command finally decided to end the war quickly. Zexthara continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The human attacks were spreading across our territory. Supply lines were failing, morale was dropping, and our own people were beginning to question whether we could win. The Supreme Council authorized the use of our ultimate weapon. Krival felt his blood chill. Every Velfari knew about the planet killer, though it had never been used in actual warfare. A massive weapon could destroy entire star systems, turning planets into cosmic dust and extinguishing all life within several light years. The weapon was moved to the edge of human space, Zexthara said. We sent a final ultimatum to Earth. Complete surrender within 72 hours, or we would begin systematically destroying every human world. We expected immediate capitulation. No rational species would risk total extinction for the sake of pride. But the humans didn't surrender. Krival said. It had become a refrain throughout the night. They didn't even negotiate. Instead, they did something that still haunts my dreams. Zexthara's compound eyes focused on nothing, seeing events that existed now only in memory. Admiral Karen White and General Tony Rodriguez gathered the entire human fleet. Every ship they had, from massive battle cruisers to small patrol craft. They formed a single formation and began moving toward our homeworld. The old commander's hands shook as he continued. We couldn't understand it. They were outnumbered 50-1. We had the planet killer weapon. We had superior technology and defensive positions. It should have been a massacre. But they kept coming. What were they thinking? Krival whispered. Captain Jim Barnes transmitted a message from the lead ship. Commander Rachel Thompson and Major Scott Lewis were standing beside him. The message was simple and direct. Orange looked straight into the camera and said, "You want to play extinction games?" Humans invented extinction games. Zexthara paused to wet his lips with the remains of his drink. At first, we thought it was empty bravado. Human psychological. Warfare, trying to make us hesitate. But then our intelligence division started receiving data transmissions from the human fleet. What kind of data? Kreval asked, though he dreaded the answer. Scientific reports. Biological and anthropological studies of human evolution. Dr. Helen Moore, their leading xenobiologist, sent us detailed analysis of human development over millions of years. She wanted us to understand exactly what we were fighting. The commanders. Voice took on a tone of scientific precision, as if reciting facts could make them less terrifying. Humans didn't evolve on a peaceful world, Kreval. Most intelligent species develop on planets with stable climates and abundant resources. We evolved intelligence to cooperate, to build, to create better lives for ourselves. But humans evolved differently, Kreval said, beginning to understand. Humans evolved intelligence specifically to kill things more efficiently. Zexthara's mandibles clicked rapidly. Their homeworld tried to exterminate them repeatedly. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, plague, famine, predators that made our worst nightmares look like pets. Each catastrophe killed most of them, but the survivors became stronger. The old commander leaned forward, his voice growing more urgent. Dr. Moore's data showed us something terrifying. Humans didn't just survive one extinction event. They survived dozens. Each time their species was reduced to a few thousand individuals, they rebuilt and came back stronger than before. How is that possible? Kreval asked. Because they learned to weaponize hope itself. Zexthara's voice cracked. Every other species sees extinction as the end. Humans see it as a challenge to overcome. They developed cultures, religions, philosophies, and technologies all focused on one central idea, that impossible situations are just problems that haven't been solved yet. The commander stared at his empty glass as if it contained answers to questions too terrible to ask. Colonel Derek Price sent us psychological profiles of human behavior under extreme stress. The data showed that humans don't break down when facing impossible odds. They become more determined, more creative, more willing to take risks. That makes no evolutionary sense, Kreval protested. It makes perfect sense if you understand their environment, Zexthara replied. On a world that constantly tries to kill you, the ability to see hope in hopeless situations becomes a survival trait. Humans who gave up when things looked bad didn't survive to pass on their genes. Only the ones who kept fighting, kept trying, kept believing they could win against impossible odds, lived long enough to have children. The cantina seemed to grow colder as Zexthara continued. Price explained that human warfare isn't driven by anger or hatred. It's driven by pattern recognition. They see a threat, analyze it, and develop solutions. The more dangerous the threat, the more creative their solutions become. What happened when the human fleet reached your homeworld? Kreval asked. They didn't attack. They took defensive positions around our planet and waited. Admiral White sent a message to our Supreme Council. She wanted to have a conversation. Zexthara's voice became flat, emotionless. White explained that humans had been studying our species since the war began. They understood our psychology, our culture, our military doctrine. She said that humans respected the Velthari as worthy opponents, but that the war needed to end before both species suffered irreparable damage. That sounds reasonable, Kreval said. It was reasonable. That's what made it so terrifying. The commander's eyes reflected the fear he had felt in that moment. White wasn't threatening us. She was educating us. She explained that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to survive extinction events. They were experts at it. What did she mean? Kreval whispered. She meant that if we used the planet-killer weapon, if we tried, to exterminate humanity, we would fail. Some humans would survive, somewhere, somehow. And those survivors would spend the rest of eternity making sure we never threatened anyone again. Zexthara's voice dropped barely audible levels. White showed us historical records of what humans do to species that threaten their existence. They don't just fight back. They make sure the threat can never happen again. Ever. The old commander looked directly at his former subordinate. General Rodriguez sent us tactical analyses showing exactly how humans would rebuild after our attack, how they would modify their technology, adapt their strategies, and eventually hunt down every Velthari in the galaxy. Not out of revenge, but out of practical necessity. But surely the Supreme Council didn't believe such threats, Kreval said. They weren't threats. They were predictions. Scientific calculations based on human behavioral patterns. Zexthara finished the last drops of his drink. Major Lewis sent us the final piece of information. A simple statement that ended the war. What did he say? He said that humans had never lost a war they truly needed to win. Not once in their entire history. They had lost battles, lost campaigns, even lost countries. But whenever human survival was truly at stake, they found a way to win. Always. The cantina fell completely silent. Even the background music seemed to fade away. The ceasefire was signed within hours, Zexthara said quietly. Not because we feared their weapons or their numbers, but because we finally understood what we were fighting. A species that had spent millions of years learning how to survive the impossible. He stood slowly, his movements shaky from alcohol and exhaustion. Remember this, Kreval. Humans don't just refuse to accept defeat. They've evolved past the point where defeat is even a possibility for them. As the broken commander walked away, Lieutenant Kreval sat alone in the empty cantina, finally understanding why the mighty Velthari Empire had agreed to peace with a species that had barely left their home star system. Some wars couldn't be won because some enemies simply didn't know how to lose.